Father, we thank you for the truth of your scriptures. And there is, in fact, meaning and not just utility in our lives. And we thank you for our teacher this morning, Joanna. We pray that you would bless her and us with the presence and understanding of the Holy Spirit. That we might grow in Christ, closer to you and closer to one another. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Joanna.
All right, so welcome back to week 4 of this series. I did struggle with what to do for this last week because there's so much that we could have done, and we didn't by any means cover everything that's in the book. So I went back and forth with what passage or theme we were going to cover. And when I decided on this topic of the end, and the tension here, I mean it to be kind of deliberately vague and multivalent, this tension between the end, and as in the end of human life, as we'll see in this passage, a kind of ominous, looming end that's described, but also the end in the sense of kind of resolution or conclusion. And when we do have that language even in the passage, so we're going to take a look at the end of the book, the last passage in the book, and you can see in that last, if you turn over the page, it says the end of the matter. That's the part of the editorial kind of conclusion. So there it's using end in that sense. But most of the passage is talking about the end in terms of the end of life. So we're at the end of this series, the end of the book of Ecclesiastes. The passage is about the end of human life, and as we'll see, it has perhaps some overtones or allusions to passages that bring up the end of the world or God's judgment day. So that's another end, and then the sense of the end, the conclusion, the resolution here at the end, at the end. So another thing about this passage is that it touches on some of the themes that we've looked at earlier. So that word hevel, that means breath or vapor, we see several times in the passage. And it touches on the idea of pleasure, the good things that we should pursue in life, which is one of the topics that we did. It deals with the issue of time, which is one that we talked about, and what to do with the days of your youth, and what time is like as you approach old age and death. And so I think it brings together a lot of these topics that we've been looking at. And so I hope you'll kind of look for that. There's also some interesting echoes of the poem at the beginning of the book. So back in week 1 of the series, we looked at that poem that I included here about the generations coming and going, the sun going around and around, the rivers flowing to the sea. And if you were here that week, you may remember that poem captures this idea of futility of toil. So even in nature, you have all these things going around and working hard, and there's so much activity, and it doesn't seem to really be getting anywhere, and it's a kind of metaphor for human life too. And we get a lot of that language echoed here in this poem, but to kind of different end in terms of the message. So if you see some Hebrew in brackets, that's pointing you to a word that is echoed it echoes that beginning poem. So what I want to do today is just read this together slowly, carefully, try to untangle it. There's lots of layers of meaning here. There's lots of disagreements about what various parts of it mean. So we'll just kind of go through paragraph by paragraph and talk through it, and talk about hopefully how it relates to these other things we've seen in Ecclesiastes the other weeks, and how it relates to us and our lives. So I appreciate your comments and questions all the way through, and feel free to break in anytime. So this first paragraph is, I think it'll echo some of the things we talked about when we talked about pleasure. I'll read this, and then we'll just talk through it and talk about what it means. So it says, "Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So those who live many years should rejoice in them all, and let them remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is hevel." So as I said, if you were here other weeks, you know hevel means literally breath or vapor, usually translated meaningless or vanity in Ecclesiastes, or sometimes futility. Has these connotations of ephemerality, futility, fleetingness, sometimes maybe mystery or absurdity, something you can't grasp. So we can try to untangle what it means in this particular passage in a minute. "Rejoice, young man, while you are young, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Follow the inclination of your heart and the desire of your eyes, and know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Banish anxiety from your mind and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are heaven. Okay, so through the whole book, Kohelet, the speaker, the teacher, has been talking about life under the sun, and that's a phrase we see over and over in the book, life under the sun. So he's talking about, life in the world, what's accessible from observation in the world, the land of the living. That's kind of sometimes in other ancient Eastern texts, that's what life under the sun means. And a lot of times there's kind of a negative, he's using a negative context. So I've seen this under the sun. This is another bad thing I've seen under the sun. He's kind of collecting a lot of bad things he's seen under the sun. And yet here he's talking about the good things about being under the sun. So it's literally here, it is good for the eyes to see the sun. So life under the sun, even though it's difficult, it's also good. And that's one of the tensions that we've kind of been exploring all along. So it says, those who live many years should rejoice in them all, and let them remember that the days of darkness will be many. So we have this contrast between light and darkness. And this idea of remembering is another maybe contradiction or tension in the book. Earlier in the book, in chapter 5, Kohelet says, he's talking about somebody who's enjoying, eating and drinking and enjoying their toil. And he says, this person will not remember the days of his life because God has kept him occupied with joy in his heart. So there it seems like in chapter 5, Kohelet's saying, well, if you're feeling happy, you don't remember, you're not going to think about or dwell on those days in your life. Whereas here, he counsels people to remember that these dark days are coming, and that should increase your joy in life. You see that word remember on the next paragraph too. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, kind of the same idea, and we'll get there. So there's a kind of tension between remembering or keeping something in mind and forgetting or ignoring painful things. And I'm not sure how what Kohelet, it's probably an issue of moderation or what remembering causes you to do. If remembering causes you to enjoy your life, if thinking about the bad things to come cause you to enjoy life, then that's a good way to remember. Whereas if you're constantly preoccupied with the problems and toil or worries about things to come, then that's a kind of negative remembering. But there's kind of maybe a time to remember and a time to forget in terms of that time poem, which that's not one of the lines, but Kohelet would probably say that. All right, so he counsels again this young person to rejoice while they're young. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Follow the inclination of your heart and the desire of your eyes. That's advice that is maybe contrary to some other parts of the Bible. Even I think there's a text in Numbers that says, don't follow your eyes and your heart. And in Ecclesiastes, or the Wisdom of Ben Sira, the book, wisdom book in the Apocrypha, that seems to be drawing from / dialoguing with Kohelet sometimes. Ben Sira says, don't follow your eyes and your heart to go in evil delights. So that following your eyes and your heart, it's not something that's always counseled in the Bible. And then it's interesting here how that relates to this line, and know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. So some people think that this was not originally in the text, and that some pious editor came along and said, oh, follow the inclination of your heart and desire of your eyes. That's too dangerous, so I'll add this. Know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. But a lot of people think that it works with Kohelet's system of thought. He has talked about God's judgment in other times in the book, even though I think he struggles with, he believes in God's judgment. He talks in chapter 3 about how God will bring everything into judgment, good and bad. But yet he looks around him and he sees the wicked prospering, the righteous suffering, and things like that. So I think it's a tension that he doesn't quite know what to do with. But he does believe in God's judgment. So perhaps here again he's kind of counseling a kind of moderation, or enjoy yourself but don't go too far. Elsewhere in the book we see things like that. So for example in chapter 7 he says something also you don't find very much in the Bible. Don't be too righteous and do not act too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be too wicked and do not be a fool. Why should you die before your time? So maybe this is kind of a counsel of moderation. On the other hand, one of the commentators I read thought that God's judgment has to do with that God is judging a person according to whether they have enjoyed their life and the things that God has given them. So perhaps it's an issue of God. Elsewhere in the book, Kohelet says, enjoy yourself because God has already approved what you do, or he talks about enjoying your toil is a gift of God. If you're able to enjoy that, that's a gift from God. So perhaps it's God's judgment here means if you don't enjoy yourself, that's what you're going to come into judgment for, because God has given you these good gifts and you're supposed to enjoy them. So it's not quite clear here if there's a contrast. The word and, when you see and know that for these things God will bring into judgment. In Hebrew, that and can usually be and or but. So that's tough to know if this is a, enjoy yourself, but not too much, be careful, or enjoy yourself because God has commanded for you to enjoy yourself. God has given you these gifts, and so God wants you to enjoy yourself. It's hard to decide which one that is, or maybe it's both. And then banish anxiety from your mind, put away pain from your body. Literally, pain there is a word that's often translated evil. But it has a wide semantic range: evil, calamity, disaster, bad stuff. But it seems there's a lot of contrast between bad and good here in this passage. Like I said, that word pleasant at the beginning means good. So put away bad stuff from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are hevel. So here hevel really probably does seem to have that connotation of fleeting primarily. It's something that youth and the dawn of life aren't meaningless, or they're good because he's counseling you to enjoy yourself during that time. It's not a meaningless time, but it's a fleeting time. It's ephemeral, and so if you don't enjoy it, then it's going to be gone soon. This is kind of mostly positive injunction to enjoy yourself. It's something we've seen before when we talked about pleasure. But things get really darker in the next paragraph, but it kind of continuing the same idea. So it begins, remember your Creator and the days of your youth before the days of trouble come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. We'll go on to talk about this, but I think this is an interesting idea. I was talking with Jonathan about it last night, about youth being a happier time than old age, and something that I've seen in studies actually is that there's maybe some of you have seen this U-shaped curve of happiness, so that people start out happier when they're around 20 years old, then they get less and less happy until through like middle age, 40 or 50, and then after that the curve goes up and people get happier and happier, even on the graphs that I've seen, happier than they were when they were 20. The happiness gets even higher as you live longer. So I just wondered, what people here thought about this idea of your youth, enjoy your youth, because Kohelet seems to be saying it gets worse after that. Is that true, or what wisdom do we draw from here if it's not exactly true? Love to hear people's experiences, Jan, and then Robin.
We had a code in our wedding rings that said, the best is yet to come. And it wasn't just talking about eternity.
Yeah, that's great. Robin?
Well, I wonder if the situation for older people today is a whole lot better than it was in Kohelet's time. With healthcare and,
Right. Presumably it is. I mean, presumably healthcare makes a ton of difference. I wonder, we talk today about people devaluing old age or devaluing old people, and whereas people in the ancient world or in other cultures value people who, as wise and elders in the community. So I wonder if it's a mixed bag, certainly for healthcare, and maybe that's, maybe that makes all the difference here, that people are living more healthy lives, Both of you.
Just that life expectancy was much shorter, physical labor was much harder.
Right.
You didn't have dental care. I just think
right.
that alone is to make your older life miserable.
Yeah. Bruce.
I was going to say that the upshot of the whole theme seems to be hold things lightly. When you're in your 20s, of course you hold things lightly.
Yeah.
Because everything's heavy. When you're middle-aged, you're working your tail off, trying to make sure you're going to have enough. By the time you're old, you have to hold things lightly again. You feel like you haven't got a grip.
Yeah. That's great. Okay.
I think this, the second sentence, those who live many years should rejoice in them all and let them remember the days of darkness and so forth. It's sort of a very complex and multi-layered, take on life that if you do live a long time, then you can intentionally say, well, what is the good thing in this day? And yet he also seems to say, well, but qualify that by saying that, well, if, God forbid, you come down with Alzheimer's disease, when you're in your 70s and 80s, then don't be shocked or surprised. It may happen. So that this is I think sort of complex realism that he's counseling here. And that's probably good advice, because I think it's certainly in American culture, we tend to be in denial. That, we're always happy, life will always be good. We will, die suddenly in our sleep, and it'll be great. So I think that this is some sort of a bucket of cold water in the face.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a great phrase to point out that, those who live many years should rejoice in them all. So he isn't just saying, well, once you're done with youth, then you're done with your good life. You should rejoice in as many days as God has given you to rejoice in. And yes, there may still be trouble, but so I think he does see some rejoicing beyond youth also. Bill, were you going to say something?
I'm just wondering if a piece of this, building on what Jack just said, is the multivalent character of the word remember.
Yeah.
That, like Hebel, he's relishing the ambiguity of certain words, and remembers seems to be used both in terms of comprehension and in terms of recollection. So part of what he's guiding us towards is the recognition that youth is wasted on the young, and that with perspective we can find meaning.
Yeah, that's great. Jan?
I was thinking about this remembering, and Bruce last week bringing up about the stones of remembrance. And we, as long as we have the capability, we have choices of remembering, and remembering God's faithfulness. As you get older, it helps cushion the gaps, it helps cushion the things that are hard. Gratitude fills in, as does grace, those holes, those losses, those questions about what's ahead.
Yeah.
You've seen God's faithfulness in the past, and why those stones matter for our children and our grandchildren, that we have shared those things. Not, oh God, what's happening to this world? Technology is so awful, social media. Is there nothing good? Is all bad? No, there's a lot that's good.
Yeah.
And to remember those things and share those and not fall into the pit of despair of our own words.
That's such a great perspective. Thank you. Mother Susan?
Well, I just wondered, I missed last week, so you may have covered this, but the days of darkness, is that a reference to the later years or the afterlife?
Yeah, that's a great question. So people do debate what he's referring to there. He's certainly talking a lot about death in this passage. So yeah, is the days of darkness just death? I think, to me, it seems to be, it could be a both and. I think he's probably talking about times in life, difficulties in life. It could be even old age or just other difficulties that could come in life. In the second paragraph, he talks about the days of trouble. Literally, that's evil again, the days of trouble or calamity, and the years when you have no pleasure in them. So that seems to be something when you're alive. On the other hand, there is a lot about death. I mean, he doesn't seem to really see a kind of consciousness surviving beyond death, I would say probably, because he talks about, people die, their life breath returns to God at the end of this paragraph. And late in chapter 3, he talks about, people die, they're just like animals, and so who knows if their spirit goes up and the animal spirit goes down. He doesn't seem to think that. So, I don't think he's necessarily thinking of a conscious period of time after death, but perhaps the days of darkness partly do refer to death, because you do, as we'll see, this language of darkness, 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 and lamps going out and stuff in the next paragraph does seem to focus on death. So maybe it's a both and there. Jonathan?
This is maybe a little bit askew from the kind of main topic right now, but I was just noticing this first paragraph at the end where I really like that banish anxiety from your mind and put away pain from your body, the kind of, mind and body thing. But I was just noticing in the Hebrew, it's the word for mind, there's just the word for heart, which of course, lave, which is the same word that's used for heart in the previous sentence. It's just a common word for heart, because Hebrew doesn't really have a separate word for mind.
Right.
And also the word anxiety is just the standard word for anger, which also, anxiety is fine. But anyway, so I don't have anything maybe to point out so much as just to ask, because I just wonder what.
Yeah, I didn't notice that mind, heart, but in previous weeks I did change some mind in NRSV to heart, because Kohelet, especially in that passage we looked at in chapter 2, where he's trying to pursue all these kinds of different pleasure things, he's always talking to his heart. Like, I said to my heart, let's enjoy ourselves. I said to my heart. And so he is, in that passage, he's following his heart in a way that actually doesn't end up very fulfilling in the end. So I should have kept heart here to make it more consistent. But, yeah.
I was told by someone who's a Hebrew scholar that the word is literally liver, not heart, which is more of a gut thing. And I wonder if maybe another translation might be, at a gut level, let go of anger, let go of anxiety. Because in our culture, we say, when we say the heart, we think about romantic stuff. Most of us do anyway. Maybe in Christian circles, the heart is something more lofty. But this seems to be about meeting life at a gut level and not worrying too much, not clinging and fighting and striving all the time, because it's not going to get you anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, there is another word for liver. Isn't liver? Liver is often used. Liver. I'm trying to think. It is used in other places about emotions, and I'd have to look up where it's actually used. But I think usually in the Hebrew Bible, heart is a kind of like a thinking / feeling organ. What do you say, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think your basic point is totally right about maybe that there was a different conception about that there wasn't quite the mind, duality that we have, but it is a separate word. Yeah, this word here, the heart, it's different from the word liver, which is also used for kind of gut stuff. So, yeah, sometimes like in meditation we'll say like my innards, although that's yet another word, but like my innards are kind of convulsed.
Yeah,
like,
turmoil. Yeah.
But
so definitely organs are involved with emotions in the Hebrew Bible. But yeah, it is interesting, I think, this follow your heart, and especially in light of chapter 2, where he did follow his heart, he's talking to his heart, he's trying to enjoy himself and didn't get very far. So it's another one of these, I think, tensions where, following your heart, the desires of your heart can be good, or it can be kind of futile and empty. All right, let's go on to the next paragraph, because there's a lot to talk about here. So this is one of the more well-known passages probably in Ecclesiastes, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And it's been read lots of different ways. I'll read through it and we'll talk about it. But it's often seen as an allegorical description of an aging body, and so that these different elements are actually meant to be decoded as different parts of the body. That goes way back to Rabbinic Midrash and the Aramaic translation of the Bible, so that's very ancient interpretation and still very common today. But other people see this text on a more literal level, and maybe kind of literal / symbolic, that it's a literal picture of some kind, and people have different ideas what that picture is, but perhaps that the literal picture points symbolically to something bigger. So it's working a little bit different from allegory, which is the image that you're decoding. The image and the referent are not necessarily related to each other, whereas in a symbolic reading, there might be a literal picture of something that's pointing to something bigger. So we'll talk about some examples, but I'll read it and then we'll see if we can talk through the many layers that might be here. So, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years draw not near, when you say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return with the rain. In the day when the guards of the house tremble and the strong men are bent, the women who grind cease working because they are few, and those who look through the windows see dimly. When the doors in the street are shut and the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of the bird, or an alternate translation, the sound of the bird rises. And all the daughters of song are brought low. When one is afraid of heights and terrors are on the road, the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and the caper bud falls. Because all must go to their eternal home, and the mourners will go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, and the golden bowl is broken, and the pitcher is broken at the fountain, and the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the breath returns to God who gave it. And then the last line of Kohelet, or the editors maybe, Hevel of Hevels, says the teacher, all is Hevel. And then after that, we have this kind of authorial or editorial epilogue that hopefully we'll get to as well. Okay, so in this kind of allegorical reading that you might be familiar with, a lot of these things are supposed to point to parts of the body. So like the guards of the house trembling might be arms or legs, and the strong men being bent, maybe bones or back or something being bent. The women who grind would be the teeth and their cease grinding. It's just it's literally grinders, feminine plural. So the grinders cease because they are few. So maybe that's teeth that are falling out. Those that look through the windows see dimly would be the eyes. And the doors of the street are shut. Some people say ears. People aren't hearing well, and then it talks about the sound of the grinding is low. In this reading, when you get to one rises up at the sound of the bird, that people usually read that as non-allegorical, that just like older person is a light sleeper, so anything wakes them up. And also similar, one is afraid of heights. It's just, I don't know, for some reason old people are afraid of heights. That's probably not really true. But and the almond tree blossoming could be somebody having white hair, like the blossoms on a tree. The grasshopper dragging itself along, and the caper bud failing. Sometimes they're seen in terms of sexual function, or just that somebody's kind of stooped over or something like that. Anyway, there's been various ways that people have read this allegory. And like I said, this is a very ancient way to read it. But as you can see, some of the images work better than others in the allegory, and some aren't allegorical at all. So, you know, rising at the sound of the bird, or the mourners going about in the streets, that wouldn't be read allegorically, that would just be a literal description. And some of them are kind of a stretch. So other people, as I said, have tried to read this on maybe a literal level. So some people, one scholar has seen this as a vision of an approaching storm, which represents death, I guess. Michael Fox, whose book I talked about at the beginning, he sees this as a funeral scene. So everything is, the city is kind of shutting down because everybody's going to the funeral, and so it's evoking death. Some people think it draws on city laments. So in the Bible we have these, and also other places in the ancient Near East, people talking about cities that have been destroyed, and you know, the sounds of people, the normal sounds of life are not there. Kind of animals move in, and so it may be drawing on those kinds of images. Another reading is seeing it as a kind of like house or estate in decay, and that being a kind of symbol of death. So we'll kind of go through line by line and see what we think. I think it's very possible that this is working on multiple levels, and it is difficult to nail down exactly what this poem means in terms of every image. And whether it's primarily about old age or primarily about death, but it certainly could be about both. So that image of the sun and the light and the moon and the stars being darkened and the clouds, that interestingly, that kind of darkness is used a lot of times in prophets to talk about this day of the Lord's judgment. So that's a kind of standard image of uncreation. So, you know, when God created everything, separated, made the light and the darkness, put everything in their place. And so on this great judgment day, clouds and darkness and lights being put out are standard images. I put a couple of those texts there on the reverse side from Ezekiel and Zephaniah. So Ezekiel says, when I blot you out, I will cover the heavens and make their stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. All the shining lights of the heavens I will darken above you, and put darkness on your land, says the Lord God. Or Zephaniah, the great day of the Lord is near, near and hastening fast. The sound of the day of the Lord is bitter. The warrior cries aloud there. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of ruin and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. There's lots of other examples of that, and the New Testament draws on these passages as well. So clouds, darkness are standard in those texts about God's coming judgment, or the day of the Lord. Also, people trembling is a common image in those kinds of texts. So that the guards of the house trembling, or strong men being bent over, that's a kind of image too. You see a little hint of that in the Zephaniah text of the warrior crying aloud. This idea that even the strongest men are going to be trembling and shaking and quaking on this day seems to draw from that. So it's kind of interesting that this poem, because the rest of the book, of course, Kohelet doesn't seem to have a lot in common with Israel's prophets, for example. It's totally, for the most part, well, you see similar concerns sometimes. The prophets bring up similar questions, but overall, his messages are not the same as the prophets. And so here seems to be drawing on this world of prophetic imagery to talk about the end of a human life, because it's a person is a kind of world to themselves, and their world is ending, or they're experiencing a kind of day of the Lord maybe in their final days. And I'm not sure quite the force of the language, but I think it is interesting to draw on this language that usually is used about this big event that's for Israel or for other nations, to talk about in the context of one person's life being snuffed out, basically. It's also interesting the image of the sun being dark, because if you remember in that beginning poem, which I put on here on the back, the sun in the first poem rises and goes down and hurries, literally pants to the place it rises. It's going around and around, and the image there is kind of negative in a way, because the sun's working so hard and yet it has to do the same thing every day. But when you look at that image contrasted with the sun going completely dark, that first image looks even kind of good. So, at least there's a kind of regularity in nature in that beginning thing, but in here at the end, the sun is going dark for the person. All right, so the image also of, the women who are grinding at the mill, we have two kinds of images here, two lines about this. The women who grind cease working because they're few, and then the sound of the grinding is low. Some of those could be seen as connected with these days of destruction as well. So in the Jeremiah text, God says, in this coming destruction of Jerusalem, he says, I will banish from them the sound of mirth and the sound of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones and the light of the lamp. So millstones, just that somebody always would have been working in normal life, grinding at the millstones to grind the grain. And so that when millstone grinding ceases, that's very ominous, that the normal activities of life are ceasing. And that's, what Jeremiah says, and that's what it says here, and does it mean, according to Fox, the women who are grinding stop grinding because they have gone to the funeral? That's how he reads it. Or is it more ominous that there's some kind of big, big destruction event happening, and that's a lot of people have died, so the grinding ceases? Or is this talking about teeth, like in the allegorical reading? The sound of the bird one, it's difficult to, the language isn't that difficult, but it could be read different ways. So one commentator who reads the sound of the bird rises, he argues that, similar to a lot of biblical passages where we have descriptions of destroyed cities or in uninhabited areas where wild animals move in, and lots of times there are birds that are maybe birds of prey hanging out there, and they're hooting, and they're, it's this ominous picture. We think of birds singing as a positive thing, and I think that's probably in the Bible as well, but perhaps this is an image of like human life is decreasing, and so you have these wild animals or birds hooting. And then these images from nature, also, if you're trying to read this on a more literal level, have been read in a couple of different ways. Some people see the images of nature like the almond tree blossoming and the capers, and again, there's textual issues that make this hard to read or able to read different ways. The grasshopper or the locust might refer to a plant rather than an animal. There's some plants with the name locust. So some people see this as a kind of flourishing of nature in contrast to human life. So humans die, and yet the almond tree blossoms, maybe the grasshopper is moving along, or the plant is, plants are still making their fruit. Other people read this as nature languishing. So another way, the almond tree, the word could also mean it becomes repulsive. So like the tree is dying, the grasshopper or maybe a plant is dragging along or drooping, the caper bud from the caper bush or whatever is falling or failing. So sometimes that also is used in pictures of judgment time, is that even nature is kind of languishing. So maybe it's hard to decide even, is this a picture of nature flourishing in contrast to human life, which is ending, or is it a picture of human nature dying, kind of in going along with the idea of life going away. Some of this language again echoes that beginning passage. So people going to their eternal home. That word of going and eternal. If you turn over to that to the first passage on the other side of the handout, it says that generation goes. That's the same word, but the earth remains forever. Olam in Hebrew. So the earth is remaining forever in this first passage. People are going to their forever home. Also, the mourners going about the streets, that word is savav in Hebrew. It means to go around. That's the word used about the wind. It's going around and around and around in this first passage. And also, interestingly, so we talked about this the first week, that wind and spirit or breath in Hebrew are the same word, ruach. So here at the end of this passage, it says, the dust returns, another word that's used about the wind. The dust returns to the earth as it was. Earth is used also in that passage. And the breath, the ruach, returns to God who gave it. So in the opening passage, we have the ruach, the wind, returning, going about on its circuits around and around. Here we have the ruach, the human breath, returning in a way to God. So instead of this cyclical returning around and around of wind, we have kind of just a one-time returning of the breath to God. And so, as I said, this cycle of nature that we see going around and around, and even in the beginning he talks about a generation comes and a generation goes. So people are dying, but then a new generation comes along and things just keep going. But when it's the end of one's life, there's such finality emphasized, and interestingly drawing on these words that talk about the cycle and the repetition, but there's just this finality that these words are used about that isn't there in that isn't emphasized in that first poem, but it's drawn on here. The golden bowl, the silver cord and the golden bowl at the end, the pitcher that's broken, the wheel that's broken, all these must be images of death, but it's not quite clear how they point to death. Some people say the cord and the bowl might be two parts of a lamp. The cord might be a tendril or something, and lamps sometimes were stylized like trees, representing a tree of life. So it might be like a tree with a bowl that holds the oil in it, and so the whole lamp that represents light and life is broken. Also, they've found, archaeologists have found pot shards and broken pottery in graves, so it seems to have been a custom maybe to break pots. And in the Bible, humans are seen in various texts as vessels of clay that God has formed. So this idea of the Creator forming the vessel and then breaking it would point to death. So these all point to death. The wheel, it might be like a water wheel on a well or something. It might also be just some kind of other vessel. The people propose other translations for that. But all of these are obviously, as I said, images of death and dying, but not quite clear how exactly they point there. So there's a lot going on here. Anybody want to respond to this or see, what kind of reading makes sense to them? Or I just like to hear your feedback on this one.
Verse 6 almost seems to be by a different author. It's so poetic, and and brings in these metaphors that are so powerful. I mean, maybe I've read too much Henry James, but things like the Golden Bowl are so resonant and seem to come out of nowhere here. What do you make of sort of the immersion in this form of poetry at this penultimate moment?
Yeah, I never thought of it coming out of nowhere, although you're right that the images are different from what's come before. I mean, I do think there's just a lot of layers, and he's maybe piling up all these different ways of talking about death, drawing on this kind of, eschatological, end time judgment kind of language on the one hand, and also drawing on like the idea of cities being destroyed, and maybe this idea that we've talked about other weeks of, Israel's history kind of haunting the background of this text. If we think about the destruction of Jerusalem, not explicitly talked about, but maybe their history is kind of there haunting the background. And then, I don't know, yeah, I guess I do see what you're saying about this being different images. I guess it's just, to me, it seems like reaching up to this climax of, he's drawing in as many images and powerful motifs as possible, and perhaps this idea of a lamp. I mean, if the cord and the bowl go along with a lamp, I think that fits well with this image of light that he used at the beginning. The lights are all going out, and if a lamp is a symbol of light and also life, maybe through a tree image, that would work well for echoing that beginning part of light is ending, light is going out. And also, he's talked elsewhere about people being dust, this kind of Genesis 3, Genesis 2 and 3, people created out of dust, going back to dust. That's something that we've seen before. So I think the pot, everything being broken, and the spirit returning to God who gave it, does fit well with that. So I guess...
It also seems that the fact that the pitcher is broken not in the field, but at the fountain, i.e. just where it is bound to be filled. The wheel, whether it's a water wheel or a cart wheel, it's not, broken somewhere else. It's broken at the cistern. Yeah. It almost seems to point to this sense of frustration and irony at the moment when things should be filled. Yeah. They cannot be filled. Yeah. They cannot serve their purpose. Which seems to also go back to this sense throughout the book that the life we are in is a preparation for another, and we should realize that all of this is a dawn of life, not all of life. I mean, is that...
So you think that Kohelet is saying that?
I think that's right. And it would seem that in pointing us to this this moment of extreme frustration, the pitcher breaking at the fountain, he's kind of driving home that point in a poetic way, but maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, I mean, I think the cistern and the fountain might be working on a couple levels, because on the one hand, there are places of kind of life and water, springs coming up from the earth, but also that word cistern, pretty sure it's bor, which means pit, which is also used to talk about the grave. So it maybe captures this idea of life and death together. Yeah.
Is the word ruach, isn't that the breath of God that we inhale when we're born, that we're filled with, and now we're returning it to God, and all these things that could be filled in our life are broken, and our breath goes back to God. So everything is, I just think it's all like a metaphor for that inhalation, we're now exhaling. We're no longer, our breath is broken, and it's going back.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I think it's hard for me to see him believing in some kind of life to come because of the things he says, like about humans and animals going to the same place. He says also, I think it's chapter 9, that there's no love or hate or emotions and things in Sheol where you're going. But I think maybe his frustration with that, or maybe his belief in God's judgment, but he doesn't know when that's going to happen, that might be perhaps pointing forward in terms of, if we want to think of a big revelation in the Bible, his kind of longing or for something more, and his frustration with believing in God and God's judgment and that things will be made right, but not actually seeing it, is pointing to something that we see a more full picture of later. But I'm not sure that he actually gets there. Jack?
I've always taken this to be, at least in part, an image of aging and disability. And given that take, I can see, I think, an important application for parish life as well as for our individual aging. Number one, we live in a culture, and many churches say, well, it's so important that we keep the youth in the church. And that's true. And I think this is a reminder, too, that, churches should also be friendly and, affirming of people with disabilities and with aging who have hearing and sight problems and so forth. And then on the personal side, I see this, especially the first line, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come. That's a good admonition for the value of spiritual disciplines and liturgy. In other words, he's saying here, early in life, form good habits of prayer and reading your Bible and going to the liturgy. Because then when you begin to lose it, you will have good habits. You'll be able to remember your Creator even when times are tough.
That's a good word.
I'm wondering the way you're conducting this last 4 weeks, that we were in a Jewish seminary. Would the teacher be having a similar conversation with visitors?
In what sense?
The way you conduct this. You're not, I notice you don't say, no, that you got it wrong, or anything like that. And I'm just wondering, from my background, yes, if somebody messed up, you say, no, that's the wrong. You can't do that.
Yeah, I don't know. I've learned from Jewish teachers, and I took a great Ecclesiastes seminar with one of our professors who's Jewish but not particularly observant. But my advisor is Orthodox Jew, so I've studied with, and I took I TA'd one of his classes on wisdom literature. So I've learned a lot from my Jewish teachers. I don't know how it would be conducted. I mean, in traditional Jewish schools, definitely Scripture is read through the lens of the Talmud is the most important text, but also Midrash, the Jewish interpretation, is read alongside it. And I even noticed that I have a Jewish Publication Society version Bible. They have notes in the bottom next to all these items, the maids that grind, it says, i.e. the teeth, the ladies that peer through the windows grow dim, i.e. the eyes. So I think they're drawing on Midrash there to kind of decode some of the allegory. But I think it all depends on the kind of context. I think, and also if rabbinic literature, as I said last time when we looked at some of that Midrash, there's also debates within there. Rabbi 1 says this thing, Rabbi 2 says this thing. I don't think there's, in Jewish interpretation, it's not, if it's about the law and what you need to do to follow the law, that's one thing. But if it's interpretation of a text that doesn't really have bearing on legal issues, then there's a lot of room for debate. And I think personally, with wisdom literature, there's so much depth, there's so much ambiguity, there's so much tension, especially in this book, that hearing everybody's voices is a really important part of it. Anybody else want to chime in? I had hoped to get to this last paragraph about the editor's judgment about the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments. And how that does that. Is that the message of the book? But I'm not sure we'll get there because we're out of time. But does anybody want to say what their end of the matter is, or their resolution that they're taking from this book and from what we've talked about?
We'd like to hear your thoughts,
Yeah, go
Joanna.
ahead. Speak on.
You've talked for them.
Speak. What is the end of the matter?
I'm not sure if I can pontificate about the end of the matter. I just love exploring the different tensions in this book and the idea that, you know, certain things are appropriate at certain times, and that that actually takes a lot of discernment and wisdom sometimes to figure out, is this a time to remember? Is this a time to not remember? Is this a time to pursue pleasure? Is this a time, you know, is this way of pursuing pleasure not right? And I do think, you know, people do debate how much this fear God, keep his commandments is actually the message of Kohelet, because he doesn't really talk about God's commandments. But he does talk about fearing God, and I do think that this kind of quest that he's on for wisdom, it's not contradictory with what we see in the rest of the Bible. Even though he says some things that might be looked at as unorthodox or something, I don't think it's enough. If we just echo God's words, that's not enough. But I think his kind of quest, his frustrations, the things he's working through, it validates, I think, sometimes when we feel like, you know, we have a lot of questions, or we feel these tensions in life, or we're trying to deal with them. All that can fit into a framework of fearing God and you know, kind of more, what we might call more orthodox biblical wisdom or messages.
Or we feel differently about the same thing.
Yeah.
You know,
Right. Right.
at different times.
Yeah. Well, if anybody wants to follow up with me, I'm always happy to follow up. My email address is here, so thank you for everybody's contributions these 4 weeks.
Thank you.